a cheating wife, a couple of fat eagles, and some historical context today on another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. So let's dive in. We're doing 16 and 17 in Ezekiel today. And tomorrow we're going to do Ezekiel 18 and 19. So only 2 chapters tomorrow as well. So these 2 chapters, 16 and 17, were both parables or stories that basically carry a moral, but they're a little bit deeper than just a moral. They're actually historical stories as well, and each of these stories have representatives of what happened in real life tied together into this story. So we're going to give a little bit of that meat with some of that historical context. So let's get into chapter 16, and it's all about the unfaithful wife, so to speak. This chapter is really similar in purpose to chapter 20, verse 3 through 31 as well. Once we get to that, you'll see where there's a review of Israel's history, which sets the context for the coming judgment that's going to happen after that. So, verses 1 through 3, Jerusalem had a centuries-old pre-Israelite history. Did you know that? There were actually people there before the Israelites. And the city resisted Israelite conquest in those days of Joshua. And we've read about all of this already. Joshua chapter 15, to be specific, in that history we read about in Genesis chapter 14, if you recall. It became an Israelite city only after David's conquest. We read about that in 2 Samuel 5. And there were these Canaanites and Amorites and Hittites, and they were all closely related people, actually, and they were even related to the Jebusites as well. So these pre-Israelites were the inhabitants of Palestine. Have you ever heard that word before, Palestine? I used to hear it a lot in the 80s and 90s for sure. So by going back to the people's origins here, what Ezekiel was doing is he was emphasizing that the people had always been characterized by rebelliousness and idol worship. So that's where he's leading in this. Then we see these images where Israel was abandoned by her mother. This image of a baby wallowing around in its own blood. This is Israel being abandoned. Israel was abandoned, and God has basically taken her in. When you see this term of spreading a garment, this concept of spreading a garment over a person, this was actually a wedding proposal. This was how they would propose marriage, they would spread a garment over you. And we'll read about this in Ruth chapter 3 verse 9. The portrayal is of Israel as the Lord's wife here, and when he says, "You became mine," and a wife's obligation to remain true to her husband offered a very fitting parallel to Israel's obligations to God. So we get on into verses 15 and 16. There's this accusation that she acted like a prostitute. We're speaking of Israel. And this referred both to a spiritual turning away from the Lord, as one would assume, but also to kind of a physical involvement with the fertility rites of the Canaanite paganism that we read about in Jeremiah 3, Hosea chapter 4, chapter 9, and Genesis 38. So Jerusalem played the harlot here, and she committed the sin of idolatry. Her pride led her astray. This was a very interesting story, and I tell you, just read through, and when you see some of this historical context, add this into your mind and the imagery as you read through this. We get to verse 26, and there's this spiritual prostitution that involved illicit worship of idols. It also included choosing and developing both political and military alliances when it says promiscuous acts with Egyptian men. Yeah, that is referring to sexual exploitations and sexual misdoings in the actual story itself, but the reflection of the meaning was those political and military allies. We read about this in Isaiah 23. So, to reflect on God's revulsion here over these alliances, Ezekiel described these illicit lovers as having oversized organs. He referred to them as your well-endowed neighbors. This is referring to their huge military might, their powerful amounts of money, huge amounts of money, wealth, influence over others. This is what this is referring to in this context. So we get all the way into verse 46 and 47, and the Israelites had become worse than Sodom, it said here. And Sodom, of course, was infamous for being corruption. The Bible frequently compares cities or peoples to Sodom, which was taken to be really the epitome of evil and wrongdoings and degradation in biblical context. Remember, if God had destroyed Sodom with all of this fire and sulfur, and Gomorrah with all this sulfur and brimstone or whatever it was, then why would he not destroy Israel for their sins? Because according to this, their sins were worse than Sodom's. So wouldn't that kind of mean God would be unjust if he didn't punish Israel? I think so. I think Samaria and Sodom were Judah's sisters in sin when it's in this storyline here. And if God had not punished Judah, whose sins were so much worse than Samaria's and Sodom's, he would definitely have been an unjust God. And we know that God is not unjust. God is a just God. That means not only will we get the rewards for doing the good things, if we don't follow him and do what he asks of us, there will be consequences as well. It's not just all rainbows and butterflies, there actually are consequences to our negative actions. And we get to verse 59. Essentially, Jerusalem's contempt toward the oath and the breaking of the covenant would be answered by the suspension of God's own covenant obligations. Basically, God's saying, look, you broke this covenant. You didn't do what you're supposed to do, so I'm not going to do what I said I was going to do for you. So you have broken it. But this is also going to lead into a new covenant, a new message. The permanent covenant is actually the new covenant that's spoken of in Isaiah chapter 59, verse 21, and also in 61, verse 8, and Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31 to 34. But it should be viewed as closely related to that covenant he had with Abraham, because the features of the new covenant were actually the outworkings of the basic elements of God's promises to Abraham that we had read about earlier. Then we're going to move on to chapter 17. Read these with this historical context, and it's going to bring so much more meat into your reading, and it's going to give you a little bit more to think about. So it starts out here saying basically that pose a riddle, speak a parable. Okay, so a riddle is this obscure, mysterious saying that you can't really figure out what it means. It kind of hides the truth, and that a parable is going to tell. So a riddle hides the truth, but a parable has an underlying truth. And if you put a riddle and a parable together, it kind of basically puts that underlying truth into a new light, is what this is trying to say. And this huge eagle that starts out is actually Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, after doing some research. And the fulfillment of this riddle came in Nebuchadnezzar's campaign against Jerusalem in 597 BC and his deportation of Jehoiachin and Ezekiel as part of the second deportation to Babylon. That can be found in 2 Kings 24 and 2 Chronicles 36. Now, Lebanon here refers to Jerusalem. The cedar refers to David's dynasty and his royal family. The top of the cedar that was removed by the king of Babylon was Jehoiakim, who was taken into exile in 597 BC. And the land of merchants, of course, refers to Babylon. And then there's a second huge eagle. What is this second huge eagle all about? Well, this is actually the Egyptian pharaoh. Not exactly sure which one it is, but we've kind of narrowed it down over time, and historians and scholars have narrowed it down to either Psammetichus II, which was in 595 to 589 BC, or Hophra from 589 to 570 BC. So it was one of these two pharaohs is who the second eagle is. We get to verse 13, and the phrase, "He took one of the royal family and made a covenant with him." This describes Nebuchadnezzar's installation of his own puppet king, who was Mattaniah, whom he renamed Zedekiah. You remember we did a lot of reading about Zedekiah. We've learned a lot about him. We get to verses 16 through 18 here in chapter 17, and the prophecy, "He will die in Babylon," was fulfilled in 2 Kings 25, verse 7. Now, there were some messianic images here. That sprig that was mentioned was kind of served as a forerunner of the messianic figure that's mentioned later. And of course, the concept of the Messiah as that low tree or the dry tree awaiting glorification fits with the view of the Messiah as the suffering servant. Now, I hope that this has touched you. If it has, click that like button, that subscribe button. Of course, click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video. And also hit that little boxing glove so you can rumble with me on Rumble. And I hope to see you tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.